G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program with Mags, and welcome to the Vehicle Assembly Building, where we are quite quickly putting together the first of our two launches for today. So, I hope you enjoyed the little montage I did to get through the very early parts of the science and development in Kerbal Space Program. This is going to be more of the same. Today's mission is orbits. We're looking to start off with a straight up orbit of Kerbal for our first mission. We haven't achieved that within the game yet, and then we're looking to perhaps go and orbit the Mun with a new rocket design. Now, it's actually quite possible in stock Kerbal Space Program to be able to achieve this on your very first mission with just the base level tech that you get available, but as many people have noted from the last video, I actually have a number of mods installed that make this significantly more difficult. In fact, a good portion of my mod selection is actually increasing difficulty level of the game. Anyways, with our rocket ready for deployment, away we go. So, the base design of this first orbiter is 4 solid fuel rocket boosters which are burning away, as well as a main liquid engine for the ascent stage. The liquid engine features a vectorable engine. I'm running it at low power at the moment just so I have some control over the spacecraft in conjunction with the SAS system while the rocket itself is at its heaviest point. And the SRBs have just fueled out, so jettison them and continue on. Now, these are not the biggest SRBs that I actually have available. I actually picked the cheapest that I had available that had the required thrust in order to make this orbit as easy as possible. As you notice with the service module at the base of the crew capsule, the primary purpose of this mission is to gather as much science as we possibly can before returning directly to Kerbal. And cost efficiency is actually very important. The very next mission that I want to do, as I said, is go to the Mun, and for that I need funds, specifically to upgrade the astronaut complex. Sounds like an odd one to upgrade, but I don't actually need any of the tracking stations or even the VAB upgraded initially in order to be able to make a Mun orbit. But what is useful is the ability to EVA, or leave the crew module in order to collect science experiments. So, having finally expended the fuel from the primary ascent stage, we jettison it. We don't need to ignite our engines immediately. We now have an apoapsis of over 70 kilometers, which is perfectly fine. We just need to wait until we close distance to our apoapsis before we ignite the boosters and begin our circularization burn. Now, of course, this isn't the optimal angle to come in for an orbit. They will improve as I get access to new technology. The major issue here is actually, well, it is technology, having enough science to be able to unlock the components I need to really refine everything that I do in this early stage of my Kerbal career, but is also funds. This Kerbal Space Program career is being played in hard mode. Now, this means a couple of things. First things first is that all of the buildings at Kerbal Space Center do need to be upgraded, and they are very, very expensive. In fact, I think they nearly double in cost when you go up to the maximum difficulty level, which makes upgrading all the facilities rapidly an issue. You need to generate a lot of funds. But more than that is the parts themselves. Now, when you build a rocket in career mode, each part costs you money, and that hasn't changed. In hard mode, however, getting access to that part after having unlocked it with science also costs money, quite a bit. So actually unlocking all of the components after you've managed to get the required science to actually have them available, it foots up a really big bill really rapidly as well. Now, at this point, I've done the first part of my circularization burn. However, we pushed our apoapsis out too far and we were burning inefficiently. We were wasting fuel. So I've let time move on just a little bit and allowed us to reclose on our apoapsis so we can begin the second part of our circularization burn. This will be the part of the burn that actually puts us into orbit, and at that point we can start doing the science experiments. Now, the reliance on money is one of the things that makes Kerbal Space Program hard when you're playing in hard mode. Your initial launches, the first time you do something, so the first time you orbit the Mun, the first time you orbit Kerbal, the first time you land on a body that is not Kerbal, these will all give you significant boosts in funds, especially if you happen to have picked up the required mission that is related to them. So you'll get a big burst very quickly, but it's never quite enough, especially if you want to do multiple missions back, because the second, third and fourth landings will not get you that sort of finance. You will receive a little bit, but nothing to the volume that you receive for achieving something for the very first time. Now start adding 200,000 or 300,000 credits here, 200,000 or 300,000 credits there, upgrading the buildings inside of the Kerbal Space Center, plus, 50 to 100,000 credits here or there, buying the various components inside of the tech nodes that you've unlocked with your science, and suddenly that money you get filters away very quickly. You can now build vastly larger, more complex rockets, but they're also more expensive, so these need to be offset by some kind of money-making mission. Thankfully, the mission options do actually have some good money-making missions to actually run and to keep your funds up in this environment, but it requires you to complete a series of set goals. And these goals may not coincide with collecting a new series of science in order to unlock future tech nodes. It may not correspond with somewhere that you actually want to go. You may have to just go to a place that you've already been to and rerun science experiments that you've already run. And I actually really quite like this. It adds a business element to the space program. One that must be managed, otherwise your space program will go bankrupt and you will no longer be able to launch. So, we are now at our periapsis, the lowest point in our orbit, and firing our retrograde burn. This will descend us back into the atmosphere of Kerbal and set us up for our re-entry. Now, in order to ensure the science experiments actually make it back to Kerbal during the re-entry process itself, what I've done is I have the parachute on top of the command module. The command module is attached directly to the service compartment, which all the science experiments are kept inside, and underneath the service compartment is a heat shield. All going to plan, our command module should cross the terminator into the light side of the planet during the re-entry process, and the entire command module should remain stable during descent, and we should have no problems at all. I know the lack of explosions is not very Kerbal-y, but I also have it set so that my Kerbals will not respawn if I kill them, and I like to keep my 4 starting Kerbals alive if at all possible. Everybody else is expendable. And now I say that, I should probably also mention that I'm thinking about creating a series of Kerbals for all of my Patreon supporters, so you will actually appear in game. I do, however, promise to do my absolute best to not kill you in a horrible manner. I won't guarantee it, but I'll promise to try. So at 58 kilometers and descending rapidly, we're about to encounter the thicker part of the atmosphere and the shock heating will begin. To those who are going to ask, and I know you are going to ask, how did I get Kerbal to actually look like this, or get KSP to look like this? This is Eve, Scatterer, and Planet Shine, all with the appropriate configuration files to work together. And with temperatures rising, it's time to jettison that last fuel tank. It is now clear, so we now have the heat shield exposed directly down our descent path. Now, our descent angle into the atmosphere is actually not all that steep. We're coming in very, very, very shallow, so our descent is actually going to take quite a long time. And at this point, all I'm really doing is just making sure the command module remains stable with that heat shield always facing forward. Because we have the weight of the service module directly underneath the command module, it's very easy for this particular setup to become very unstable, and if that happens, the command module will turn over, pointing the crew capsule directly into the path of travel, and it simply won't take the heat going nose first. It will destroy the parachute, which prevents us from deploying it. We'll slam into the ground if we survive at all, but more than likely, on a long descent like this, the crew compartment or the crew capsule itself will vaporize during re-entry. Passing below 27 kilometers now. At this point I was actually thinking maybe I should have gone into the atmosphere just a little bit steeper. I know for a fact that the heat shield can definitely take it, but the time for descent was incredibly long. And at just below 900 meters per second in the atmosphere at 18 kilometers, the thermal shockwave finally subsides. We are still decelerating, but we are now cooling. We've survived re-entry. Just jettisoning the heat shield, and this turned out to be a very, very, very big mistake. The pod was very stable the whole way down, and then I released the heat shield and immediately rotated and put the crew capsule forward, turning it into a bullet heading towards the ground. Thankfully I was still able to deploy the parachute without an issue. But that did turn out to be a little bit of a problem. In future, if I happen to use this design or a setup like this ever again, I will be keeping the heat shield on the bottom, because as it turns out, the whole time, it was actually what was balancing the command module itself. So, as Kerbal Construction Time is currently not updated for 1.2.2, I can't have it installed, so I am manually fast forwarding through a week for the construction of our very next rocket. This is the Mooner 1. Brace your eardrums, the initial launch on this thing is really loud. The extra noise comes from the upgraded ascent stage. Because I want to get the core rocket and most of its liquid fuel into orbit without actually having to burn a huge amount of it, with the end goal being that the command module at the end has to use the smallest amount of fuel to complete the circularization burn for Kerbal, keeping all that fuel for the mission to the Mun itself. It's actually equipped with 8 solid fuel rocket boosters, all on very short but powerful burns, as you just saw, operating as 4 individual booster sections. These 4 boosters accelerated us to over 830 meters per second with an apoapsis of over 44 kilometers, all before passing 10 kilometers worth of altitude. Short burn on the liquid fuel boosters, burning out about a quarter of the fuel tank, puts us up over 60 kilometers and puts us up at our targeted orbital apoapsis. And this is all before we pass 33 kilometers. At this point, we're just coasting into space with the engine shut down, waiting to approach our apoapsis point, at which point we'll start the burn on the main engine to complete the circularization. And the hope is that the 3/4 of fuel remaining in the ascent stage will complete almost, if not all, of that circularization burn. Now, even though I'm carrying all this excess fuel into space, my goal here is still to be as efficient as possible. I want to save as much of that fuel as I possibly can. So, at a apoapsis travel time of around 30 seconds, or 30 seconds till we reach the apoapsis point, I felt that was way too far away. Doing the burn where I was pushing our apoapsis height up as well. So I waited until we actually got closer around to where our apoapsis was, burning at about the 5-second point. The downside of doing this with a rocket that has so much fuel on board and only has one main drive engine, especially one of the earlier engines, is that the engine is often not powerful enough to be able to push the spacecraft faster than its closing speed to the apoapsis point, which is what's happened here. We've actually passed the point of apoapsis and we're beginning to descend back into the atmosphere. So I've had to change the angle that I'm now burning on to try and compensate for the lost altitude so we don't actually lose our orbital height. So at this point we've got our periapsis up to around the 300 mark and we're about to run out of fuel in our primary ascent stage. That is negative 300 of course, we haven't achieved an orbit yet. And there we go, there's a release, and we fire the primary command module engine. Now, you'll notice the command module is using a different engine, and the climb rate of our periapsis is accelerating rapidly, and we're now already in orbit that quickly. It wasn't just ditching the rest of the weight of the rocket that changed that. I very specifically selected the engine on the command module to be an extremely fuel-efficient engine that also had the highest thrust output that I could find in vacuum. This makes it the ideal engine for this particular mission. So now we've achieved our orbit around Kerbal, we're waiting for our time to complete our transfer burn to the Mun. And we're doing this without maneuver nodes, because obviously we haven't upgraded the tracking stations or anything else back in Kerbal Space Center. I've demonstrated how to do this before, it's pretty well known amongst most KSP players, but for those who may be new, it's actually quite easy. What you want to do is wait till you see the Mun clear the horizon on a circular orbit, and then you want to burn directly into your prograde marker. What this will do is move your apoapsis almost 90 degrees through the core of the planet and begin to extend your orbit out towards the orbit of the Mun. You should continue this burn until the apoapsis passes just a little bit beyond the orbit of the Mun itself, and if you do this perfectly right, from this point you won't actually have to do anything to complete a Mun flyby. As you approach your apoapsis, the Mun will come in underneath you and you will transfer into the Mun's sphere of influence all on your own. If you get the distance just perfect, you won't even have to adjust for the planet itself. You should fly past at about 100 kilometers. And once again, with that burn complete, we just begin our drift through space. There's nothing else for us to do at this point, as Kerbal disappears and we watch the approach of the Mun. Both us flying towards it and it flying towards us. It's actually something that I find a lot of people don't think about when they think of the Apollo missions and the managing to make it to the moon. They weren't just flying to the moon, they were aiming at a moving target in space. So, as you can see, we have now transferred into the Mun's sphere of influence, and our periapsis is a little over 186 kilometers, which, it's not bad, it's a little high, it's definitely too high for what we want to achieve in this mission. But, we're good enough. But of course, today we're not actually here for just a flyby. The mission we're here to complete today for our bonus funds, in order to be able to fund some more upgrades of the Kerbal Space Center, is actually to complete a series of science experiments in orbit. So, we've rotated through and we are now burning retrograde to slow down our approach to the Mun. This will begin to circularize our orbit. Now, I don't want to burn too long here. The initial burn is just to make sure we get a nice curvature and to lower our periapsis around the Mun. At this point, I actually want to drift all the way into the Mun itself and then burn at the periapsis to be as fuel efficient as possible. This was just setting up for the burn, nothing else. And with the burn complete, it's time to start completing our science experiments and gathering all of the high altitude Mun science that we possibly can. Now, as I said earlier on, we have sunk a bunch of the credits from the Kerbal orbital mission into upgrading the astronaut complex, so we can now go EVA. This allowed us to cut down on parts here. As you can see, I have 2 goo canisters. The goo canisters cannot be repeated. Once you pull the science out of them, that's it, they're dead. So I needed to carry 2 of those, and we have 1 thermometer on the left-hand side of the ship and a pressure sensor on the right-hand side. These 2 experiments, however, are completely repeatable, so once I pull the science out of them once, they're ready to be used again. This doesn't sound like a lot, but in conjunction with a crew report from both the upper and lower section of the Mun, and a EVA report, which we can now do since we have the ability to EVA, this should drag back quite a lot of science, more than enough to unlock the next few nodes. So now we've collected the crew report, what we're going to do is reorientate the spacecraft just slightly so we can get ready for the EVA. When the crew capsule is on odd angles, the game has a little bit of an issue trying to get the Kerbals to actually grab on. And I am going to release. You don't actually need to let go of the command pod in order to collect all the experiments where I've put them at, but I wanted to fly around with the jetpack for a few seconds. Unfortunately, I've started a small rotation in the spacecraft itself, which is going to lead to some amusing time acceleration. It also should be pointed out that I've shut down all of the reaction control wheels in the SAS system at this point to conserve battery power, because I don't have access to solar panels or anything at this time to recharge the internal batteries. And if they go down, I lose the ability to maneuver this spacecraft, so I'm on battery conservation mode. So, with all the experiments collected, we jump back onto the side of the pod and we get ourselves back inside, and that's it. All of the high altitude Mun science has now been collected, or at least for the experiments that we currently have. And so we get our Kerbal very dizzy as we time accelerate down to the surface of the planet and get ready for our circularization burn. Now, while we have managed to achieve an orbit at this point, it's not enough. The mission requirements are for us to actually circularize the orbit within reason. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle, but it needs to be at least semi-close. And that appears to be good enough, so at this point we are now low enough to the surface of the Mun that I can begin performing the low altitude Mun science experiments. But first, Kerbal rise from a lunar orbit. These mods make this game so pretty, it's almost criminal. It really is. The artists that actually worked on these mods, they completely outdid themselves. Anyways, we have now achieved our low orbit, so it's time to start collecting the science experiments. So first things first, quickly use the goo canister, and we need to pick up our pressure and our temperatures, which unsurprisingly has us with a thermometer that actually can't detect a temperature due to there being nothing to detect, because you are in a vacuum, and our atmospheric pressure sensor being unable to detect anything because we are clearly not in an atmosphere. Who would have thought it? But it doesn't really matter how silly the science experiments are in the long run. We are fully capable of getting our observations back to Kerbal, and they are worth a lot of science, which means a lot of tech nodes unlocked that hopefully I'll actually be able to afford something out of. So with our science experiments collected, we once again slowly accelerate time as we complete our orbit back to our periapsis. That's going to be our optimal point of burn. We want to push our apoapsis as far away from the Mun as possible, so we break our orbit and drop from the Mun back into Kerbal's sphere of influence. Unfortunately, our approach angle on the Mun here may put us in a fairly stable orbit around Kerbal, so we're going to need to burn a little bit more fuel than I would normally like to in order to be able to complete this. But at the same time, I do want to slow our orbital speeds down. It is possible, if you have the right setup, to be able to drop directly from lunar orbit into the atmosphere of Kerbal without decelerating first. However, I don't have that setup. That's going to drop me into the atmosphere if I try and do that at around about 3,000 to 3,500 meters per second, and the heat shield that comes default with the command module, the command pod in this particular design, will not take that. The pod will vaporize. And as I suspected at the time, we transferred out of the Mun's sphere of influence into what is a relatively stable high orbit. So I need to do two burns here. First is on the periapsis of the initial orbit that we're given to lower the apoapsis down as far as possible. This is the most efficient way to decelerate our speed. Once we've completed our first burn here, we want to allow time to travel forward and do a burn at the new periapsis, dropping the apoapsis that we now have into the atmosphere. Now, I actually need to be very careful with the time acceleration at this point because I can't afford to miss any of these burns. I don't have the fuel remaining to be able to correct any mistaking burns, and if I run out of fuel without intersecting the atmosphere, of course I'm stranded in space with no way to recover because I don't have the tech to build the ship to recover somebody yet, and with the life support mod, when the life support runs out, my Kerbal dies. Thankfully, we had enough fuel remaining to complete the orbit, doing 2 deceleration burns, so we're coming into the atmosphere quite comfortably. Valentina will be getting home. Now, this is the part where the second reason why getting that astronaut center upgraded was very important. You will notice how large the science experiments are on the command pod. The heat modelling in KSP during re-entry is actually pretty advanced even in stock format. It does take a lot of things into account. It's not perfect on the physics, but it's definitely more than enough. And you'll notice the science experiments on the pod tend to hang out quite a bit. At the speed we're going to be hitting the atmosphere at, even after our 2 deceleration burns before we begin our re-entry process, it's highly likely that all the experiments on the outside of the command pod are going to be destroyed during re-entry, and if we had science in them at the time of re-entry, they're gone. Now that all the science is inside the command pod, if they happen to be destroyed, doesn't matter. So, 2,700 meters per second as we're beginning our deceleration, and we release the final stage. The fuel tank is now away. We've burnt all the fuel out of it. I was really hoping to have enough fuel left in the tank to be able to get our approach speed or our atmospheric entry speed down to 2,500 meters per second, but this isn't too bad. We're probably going to be at about 2,800, which should still be within tolerances of the command pod. So as we pass below 60 kilometers, we are now officially inside of the atmosphere and beginning our re-entry. Now the burn is going to start very, very, very quickly rather than deeper into the atmosphere as with the last one. Due to the speed that we're approaching at, we're going to start compressing the atmosphere at a much faster rate. And there goes the burn, and we can already see on the thermal detailing all the science experiments heating up. 2,813 meters per second as we're ploughing into the atmosphere. We're now at 40 kilometers and descending, and there's absolutely nothing for me to do on this run. The pod is orbital stabilized by the SAS using the last of the power we had available. And there goes all the science experiments. Good thing there was no science left in any of them. They're all inside of the pod. Thankfully our parachute is perfectly fine, and we're hands off at this point. There is nothing for us to do. Now I was getting a little bit concerned here. The temperature of the pod was getting rather high, however it's starting to finally drop back as we're decelerating. We're now below 1,600 meters per second, and our speed is rapidly continuing to fall. We've got a good angle of approach. The pod's made it. At this point, it's just a matter of time for us to slowly get out of the burn, which has just managed to complete. We've still got the aerodynamic effects going, of course. We are still moving incredibly fast at 18 kilometers. However, at this point, we are not going to burn up in the atmosphere, and it's just a matter of time to coasting down to the point where the parachutes will auto-release. Of course, that doesn't mean that the descent was completely over. It still took another 4.5 minutes to actually get to this point, most of it watching the command pod just swinging back and forth at the bottom of the parachute. However, splashdown. Home sweet home. And of course, the paycheck for that was absolutely fantastic. With over 500,000 credits in the bank, what to spend them on? Well, honestly, I was going to go for the VAB first to get us above the 30-part limit, but I've actually decided to go for the tracking station and also upgrade the mission control building. This gives us access to both patch conics and maneuver nodes, which will allow us to start plotting more complex missions. And while I don't feel I've got quite enough tech and quite enough parts availability to do the lunar landing that I want to do, I most certainly have enough parts available to do another landing. Minmus. Until next time, ladies and gents, hope you enjoyed the video and thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment in the comment section down below and to hit that like button. It helps the channel out a great deal. And until next time, fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.